Zora, History Talks Livestream.
Talk about the Great Migration. So, Dr. Moss.
Hello, everybody. Hello, testing. Actually, I'm not really going to talk about Eatonville so much. I'm more so going to talk about the maroon communities that existed all throughout Florida. All right. First of all, do you all even know who Zora Neale Hurston is? Raise your hand if you know who she is. All right. I just realized when I was walking up here, one of my students said, "Who's Zora Neale Hurston?" So before we get started, let me just talk a little bit about Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston, she was a folklorist. She was an anthropologist. She was a poet. She was born in Alabama. She was raised in Eatonville, right down the street. And she ended up becoming a literary figure during the Harlem Renaissance, right? She wrote a lot of books. But one of her things that's important about Zora Neale Hurston for me was that she was oftentimes a little bit against a lot of her contemporaries during the Harlem Renaissance. A lot of times they always felt like she was kind of, placating or appeasing some of the white population at the time, because they felt like she wasn't always talking about racial oppression in her work as much as they feel like she should have. But one of the things about Zora Neale Hurston is that she always felt the importance of showing and depicting independent Black communities and how these Black communities demonstrated self-reliance, autonomy, and that they weren't always just constant victims of white oppression, but they had agency in their own development and in their own communities, right? So, and the reason why I'm talking about maroon communities, some of y'all, if you don't know who Zora Neale Hurston is, you probably don't know what a maroon community is. So let me ask you guys this, raise your hand if you know what a maroon community is. All right, there you go. Katie, do you want to give an explanation, possible explanation?
Well, some of them are self-liberated people.
Yes.
Who form independent, self-sufficient communities.
Exactly.
Like you study.
Yes. Independent, self-sufficient, liberated peoples from slavery. Now, Zora Neale Hurston, being that she was very big on self-sufficient communities, does anybody know that she was actually against Brown v. Board of Education? You heard that, right? Now you're probably shocked, like, why would she be against Brown v. Board of Education? Do you have any idea why?
I think again because I would say her experience in Eatonville, where she had an African American community and it was so successful in its own location, that to her was what works.
Yeah, to her it was like, why do we need some court mandate to force us to integrate with a people that don't even want to be around us, when we've had institutions, teachers, staff, administrators in our own schools that have successfully brought us up as human beings? Why do we think the white man's grass is greener on the other side? Why do we think that the white man's water is clearer on the other side? Why do we think that the white man's everything is better on the other side when we can do for ourselves what the white man does for himself? And so she was like, it was almost like a slap in the face to think that you have to abandon Black institutions to go to a white institution in order to get a superior education or superior development. So Zora Neale Hurston was very big on demonstrating that Black people can do things for themselves and not shunning or scoffing at some of the local Black traditions. A lot of her writings, she talked about Black spirituality as well. She went into Polk County, Eatonville, and different rural parts of Florida and studied different religions, different spiritual systems, like hoodoo and conjuring and root work. She went to Jamaica, to a maroon community, and studied obeah. She went to Haiti, the first successful Black revolution in the Western Hemisphere, where Black people liberated themselves from slavery, and she studied voodoo. right? In all her studies, she was very big on studying self-reliant communities. And so that had also inspired me to study self-reliant communities. My whole life, I've been brought up to believe in the same way that most of the Black intelligentsia during the Harlem Renaissance was pushing, that integration was the main goal for Black people all throughout history. Equality is the main goal for Black people all throughout history. But there's a difference between fighting for equality or integration and fighting for freedom. Some Black folks just wanted to be left alone, to be free to their own devices. When I started looking into the history of the United States, history of the Caribbean, history of Latin America, I was looking for that story of Black people that just didn't fight to be accepted by their enemy, but fought for their own freedom and independence. And that's where I found out about the Maroon communities, right? Maroons were, in essence, a group of people that decided we are going to escape slavery. We're going to go up into the mountains or into a swamp or into some remote area, impregnable area that the white man can't catch us from. And we're going to draw a line in the sand, and we're going to say, if this man crosses this line, we're going to fight. They created enclaves of freedom all throughout the Americas, from North America all the way down to South America. Brazil had one known as Quilombo do Palmage in the 1600s, lasted for about 100 years. And even when that community was crushed, it splintered off into independent communities that still exist to this day. To this day, you can find the descendants of the Quilombolas, about 1.2 million of them in Brazil. You find a Maroon community in Suriname. You find them in Jamaica. You find descendants of them in Colombia. You find descendants of them in Honduras. And you can find descendants of them right here in the United States as well. The word maroon has its origins in the word cimarrón. Cimarrón was a word that the Spanish used to use to describe runaway slaves. Cimarrón through time. The French adopted the word, dropped the C from it, and used the word marron. The British used the word maroon. In Florida, that word cimarrón was used for all the runaways that escaped South Carolina into Florida. They used the word cimarrón. Cimarrón became corrupted, became known as Seminole, and Seminole became known as Seminole. So even the word Seminole has its origins in the word that was used to describe runaway slaves. So you all attend Runaway Slave State College. And right here in Florida, just like in Jamaica, just like in Brazil, just like in Mexico, just like in all the other places I just named, Colombia, there were runaway slave communities. In fact, Florida became a safe haven for runaway slaves. South Carolina started importing a lot of Africans all throughout the late 1600s into the 1700s. Many of these runaway slaves started fleeing into the remote areas of North America, finding safe havens in Florida. The Spanish, who occupied Florida at the time, decided, hey, well, any group of people that the British lose in Carolina, we can benefit from. So they passed an edict in 1693 that said any runaway slave that makes it into Florida from Carolina will be granted their freedom if they help fight in our military to defend Florida and if they convert to Catholicism. This encouraged, from 1693 on forward, more and more runaway slaves started to escape down into Florida. But not only did runaway slaves escape to live amongst the Spanish, right outside of St. Augustine, but runaway slaves were escaping down into Florida to live amongst Native Americans and to create their own independent Maroon communities. By the early 1700s, you had a Black community established right there north of St. Augustine, the San Marcos Castle, known as Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose. For short, it's also known as Fort Mose. Has anybody ever been to St. Augustine? Have you been to San Marcos Castle, right? About a mile north of San Marcos Castle, there is a museum dedicated to Fort Mose. That's where Fort Mose used to be. That's where that Black community was of those runaways that escaped to live amongst the Spanish. 1763 comes around. Spanish Florida is lost after the 7 Years' War, right? The British take it over. Most of those enslaved people, runaway slave people, Maroons, Native Americans, and Spanish, they go to Cuba. But by 1783, the land is retroceded to the Spanish, and a lot of those people come back. Immediately at the founding of this country, you can see primary source documentation between George Washington, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, and others, going back and forth about what are we going to do about the runaway slaves that keep escaping our southern states going down into Florida. This was no little deal. This was a big deal for the government at the time. You couldn't encourage planters to keep going and settling the land in Georgia if they know they're going to keep losing their slaves into Florida. Fast forward a little bit to the
we can maybe do. Yeah. That's to wake up anybody that might be sleeping, although I don't think anybody is.
Y'all asleep?
No, nobody's. I'll amplify it.
Can you hear me from Testing. Is it on?
Yeah.
Hello? All right. Should I do I have to lean over like this?
Here. Move this on. Here, just step over in front of it.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. All right, cool. All right, so anyway, where was I?
Fast forward.
Yeah. So all of our first few presidents, George Washington, John Adams, or really George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they were oftentimes going back and forth about what to do about Florida, right? As we get into the early 1800s and we're approaching the War of 1812, there was what's known as the Patriot War, right? A lot of people don't know about this, but the Patriot War, in essence, there were 5 planters that lived in Florida, originally from Georgia and South Carolina, that wanted to be able to take Florida from the Spanish, because there was fear at the time, due to the Napoleonic Wars, that Florida might be completely lost by the Spanish and fall to the French. So as we're approaching the War of 1812, there was a fear that it might be taken. So 5 planters ended up discussing with the governor of Georgia, the Secretary of State, James Monroe, and the President of the United States at the time, James Madison, how we can go and invade Florida. Now, it was supposed to be a secret invasion of Florida and an illegal invasion of Florida. But Congress ended up agreeing to it secretly, and many of the planters that were in the South, in Georgia, agreed to go and invade. And on, I believe it was January of 1811, they agreed to make this a reality. By early 1812, 250 soldiers or troops, many of them just volunteers, decided to go and invade Florida in efforts to take Florida from these rebelling Black people. Now, little did they know that these Black people were going to put up a fight, as they did. All throughout Florida, there were communities all along the Suwannee River, Black communities. There was a confederation of communities. Some of them were more Indian, some of them were more Black. But there were a confederation of communities all throughout that were willing to defend Florida all the way to the end. And even the Spanish, people thought it was going to be the Spanish that were going to put up the biggest fight during this time. But in fact, it was the natives and the runaway slaves that were putting up the biggest fight. As we approach the War of 1812, and we get closer to 1812, 1813, James Madison decided to send one more contingency of troops into Florida. That contingent was completely blown away by a number of troops that were in an area known as the 12-mile swamp in Florida. And from this point forward, James Madison, James Monroe decided to just abandon this whole thing. They believed it was a complete failure. And from this point forward, they decided to just give up on this deal. When the War of 1812 comes around, the British, they realized that the blacks in Florida are the enemy of the United States, and they used these blacks in Florida as allies during the War of 1812. Now, we all know during the War of 1812, the British ended up losing the war, but there was a fort known as Fort Nichols, all the way in Apalachicola, Florida, that they decided to leave to the blacks that were living in the area due to their assistance in the War of 1812. This fort became known as Negro Fort. Well, in 1816, Negro Fort was controlled by about 250 blacks that were living in and around the fort itself. And then outside of the fort, in the area surrounding the fort, there were about 800 people living in various maroon villages, right? Growing their own food, growing their own livestock, living independently, and using this fort as a defense mechanism for slave traders and raiders that were coming into Florida trying to take them. These are the independent communities that existed in Florida and remained self-reliant. Andrew Jackson, however, by 1816, had gone back and forth with the Secretary of State at the time and was asking for permission to destroy the Negro Fort. Eventually, they shot a cannon into the fort. They destroyed the fort. Many of these runaway slaves were actually killed in the fort. But those that were living around the maroon villages around the fort ended up fleeing into deeper down into Florida, allying themselves with other maroon villages further south. This explosion of Negro Fort marks the beginning of what's known as the First Seminole War. And we have a tendency to call it the First Seminole War to completely deny Black agency in the war itself. But the First Seminole War was a slave rebellion. As Andrew Jackson sent his troops down into Florida to kill Indians, a lot of times they realized that it was the Black people that were fighting tooth and nail for their freedom just as much as the Indians were. As the First Seminole War comes to an end, approaching 1819, the Adams-Onis Treaty is signed. It's actually completely realized by 1821. Adams-Onis Treaty, in essence, it gave Florida to the United States. Now, just because the Spanish decided to agree upon giving up Florida to the United States doesn't mean that the runaway slaves and the Indians gave it up. See, that's the difference between de jure and de facto, right? De jure is what's legal, what's written in stone. The de facto is what's the fact. And the fact of the matter was, there were still a myriad of maroon villages all throughout the state of Florida that were willing to die and defend themselves from the encroaching United States government and slavery itself. So as we get into the 1820s, Andrew Jackson sends troops down into Florida to burn down a number of maroon villages. Some Maroons stay and fight. Some Maroons flee to the Bahamas, Andros Island. Some Maroons flee to Cuba. But there was a constant effort to completely eradicate these villages, and they continued to fight all the way up until we approached the Second Seminole War. Now, the Second Seminole War is classified by historians as being the most costly war, Indian war, in U.S. history. $20 million was spent in this war. And then you had 1,500 troops, U.S. troops, that died in this war. But as General Jessup said, Thomas Jessup, what Lake Jessup is named after, as he stated, he said, "Don't be mistaken." He's talking to people in Congress. "Everybody thinks that this is an Indian war, but this is in fact a Negro war. These Negroes are fighting harder than the Indians are for their own freedom." But the Black people in Florida were slick. They realized that white people can only view Black people as being slaves. So most of the time when the Seminoles had their interactions with the US government or military, the Blacks would pretend or act like they were the servants or just the interpreters of the Red Seminoles. When in fact, they realized later on, with some of the letters by General Jessup and others, they stated that it was actually, in fact, the blacks that were controlling the Indians. But they knew the mentality, and they knew the racial hierarchy that was in the minds of the U.S. government at the time, and in the minds of many white people, slave catchers. And they said, well, we're going to pretend like we're these people's slaves. When General Jessup finally decided to come up with an order to allow all the Seminoles to go out west in 1838, many of the Red Seminoles disagreed. They refused to go. Because as soon as they saw, they all met up in Tampa, and they realized that there were a bunch of slave catchers waiting there to capture the blacks that were getting ready to leave. Once the blacks fled, who followed? The Indians fled with them. And this is when they started writing, in all the writings, you can see them say, well, we thought that the Indians were running the blacks, but it was in fact the blacks that were running the Indians. Eventually, they would end up signing a treaty that would allow them to leave Florida. Many of the blacks ended up in Oklahoma. Some of them ended up in Mexico. Some of them ended up in the Bahamas. Some of them ended up in Cuba. But this, to me, these black communities in Florida are an example of black people who fought, they bled, and they died for their own freedom in their own independent communities. They weren't begging for freedom. They weren't begging for integration. They weren't begging for any of those things. And they fought for these things. That was it? All right. So are there any questions? Nobody has any questions?
I mean, it seems like you covered all the bases.
What is the more recent history of those communities after the Emancipation Proclamation?
Oh, so there were, so a lot of them that ended up going to Oklahoma, for instance, believe it or not, they were the Cherokee that were also forced to go to Oklahoma. Were trying to enslave some of these black Seminoles that were out there. And so for safety purposes, many of these black Seminoles that were in Oklahoma ended up fleeing down into Mexico. Mexico abolished slavery as far back as 1829. And so if you go to the northern parts of Mexico, right across the border of Texas, in a place called El Nacimiento, you'll find the descendants of black Seminoles living there. Most of the black Seminoles you won't find living in the reservations down south in South Florida. If you were to do a DNA test, you'd probably find that they have African, some of them have African blood, but typically you don't find black Seminoles living there. I have met people and interviewed people that said they are descendants of the black Seminoles here in Florida, and their families like from very rural parts of Florida. So it's not to say that like some of these blacks slipped through the cracks and probably had smaller communities in certain places. But for the most part, like the great majority of them ended up going into Oklahoma, and then some of them stayed in Oklahoma, others went to Mexico, and others went to Andros Island in the Bahamas. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
All right, go get some food. Get some food. Get some drinks. You got a minute.
Is this the,
Yeah, that's it.
okay. Oh, that's right.
Was it turned off? Was it turned off? Do I have to speak louder? Louder? More into focus.
I think you know, like I said, with the speaker, it helps people hear better in totality. So if you
Speak in a loud tone so everyone can hear you. Big shout out and big thank you to Dr. Vaz. You did a great job. What I love about all of his talks is that I always learn something new and sometimes something I wasn't expecting. So I always appreciate having a colleague that always teaches me a little bit more about history itself. And for those that don't know me yet, my name is Dr. Dr. Michael Gennaro. I teach here at Seminole State. I teach U.S. history. And I want to preface this today. We're talking about the Great Migration. And this is going to have some difficult topics. So I want to start by saying that some of this will be disturbing. Some of them are going to be hard to hear. It will discuss violence. I also will be using the original wording and phrasing. So words specifically like Negro, which was used then to describe Black people. It's something we don't use anymore, only when we are quoting from the past. The St. Augustine Evening Record ran a small article in the newspaper's front page on July 26th of 1920. The Great War, as it was called, had ended less than a year prior. After a recent census that we do every 10 years in this country was made, many of the United States citizens were interested to see how impactful the movement of people were, considering how many soldiers and others had moved during the war years. So the St. Augustine Evening Record reprinted a story that they had picked up from Albany, Georgia, entitled, quote, "The Great Negro Exodus Seen in Georgia Census." The article described what we are now calling the Great Migration, saying, quote, "The seriousness of the Negro migration from South Georgia is beginning to be visualized here as the returns from the 1920 census are published. Figures on Quitman and Clay County show the former has lost more than 25% of its population. And in 10 years, and the latter has also lost 15%. It is known that no serious emigration of the white population has occurred in the last decade. And the only explanation is found is that Negroes are leaving in large numbers," end quote. What I find interesting about this article is that it plainly shows the realization that many whites at the time had either felt or saw, but could not really confirm, or maybe they feared confirming, that there were very few or less Black people around. And even more clearly than this, that the white people themselves hadn't left. For those reading and writing this article, it felt like a new problem. Where did all the Black people go? But in reality, this was a response to and confirmation of something they had already known and seen with their own eyes, but could not really fully comprehend. The South was changing, and Black people were leaving the South en masse. This article is an example of the hundreds of articles about the topic that would fill Southern newspapers for the next several decades, and you can confirm that with me. There are hundreds of these things. But this article specifically hints at something that the writers and the readers did not understand, and maybe did not really fully comprehend. Why were people leaving? All right, I get it. Maybe Georgia really wasn't paying attention. Maybe they just don't have their stuff on straight. We know in Florida what's going on, right? Florida knows what's happening. In Orlando, things, I guess, were a little bit different, although partially blaming it on the war itself. The Orlando Morning Sentinel ran an article on May 10th, 1917, 3 years earlier, and just a few weeks after the United States enters this Great War, proclaiming in a telling title, quote, "The Negro should stay in the South." Also, like many articles that we will see for the next 4 decades, this article said that, quote, "The South is the place for the Negro. The North is an adopted home, unsuited for him in climate, laboring conditions, and general mode of living. He should stay in the South. Sickness and death, different conditions under which he labors and lives, await him in the northern cities. All Negroes should stay in the South, in Orlando," end quote. Beyond the obvious racist undertones of this message, it was an appeal to stay without regard for why they might actually be leaving in the first place. The only answer that the Seminole Sentinel could give was, it was money. Quote, "Southern Negroes are dying by hundreds in the many northern cities. Negroes who have been lured north with attractive promises and big wages and easy work are dying by hundreds in northern cities, and no less than 500 have died in Philadelphia alone during the last 3 months, end quote. Please stay, the article was saying. The money, the different lifestyle, the climate, the dangers, the crime, the certain death, it's just not worth it. One can hear the fear of losing a Southern labor force to the north. In fact, something must be done, and this is what I found really interesting. Quote, Reverend J.W. Carter, the pastor of the Black AME Zion Church and secretary of the Tampa Ministers Alliance, held a conference with Tampa Mayor McKay yesterday, in which the Negro minister asked for support of the mayor and all the white citizens in putting an end to the Negro migration north, end quote. It is important to note two more things here. One is that from the start to the finish, the Great Migration, many Southerners, both Black and white, did their best to limit and even stop the migration out of the South, using the words that you see here, but also threats and even physical violence. And second, maybe even more importantly, there was fear in both communities to the unknowns of the North, its promises, its perils, its hopes, and its dangers. Was it the American dream or something else? But in the end, both of these articles and the hundreds written before and after failed to grasp why. Why are Black people truly leaving? For many, though, leaving was the only option. So today, let's talk about the Great Migration. And we're going to try to answer not only why, but what impact this has had on this country. The Great Migration was indeed one of, if not the largest domestic migrations in our country's history. It was the large-scale migration of Black persons from the southern United States to northern and western cities over roughly 70 years, starting in 1910 or so, and lasting most of the 20th century. It must be noted that at the start of the 1900s, roughly 8 to 9 million Black Americans in the country, 90% of them lived in the South and in the southern states. While impossible, of course, to calculate those numbers, how many did migrate is one of the things that we, as historians, are trying to do. It is estimated that the first wave, and this happens in two waves, the first wave between 1910 and 1940 saw somewhere between 1.5 and 3 million persons migrate north and west and to southern urban centers between the wars. As World War II ramps up, another 3 million Black persons migrated up until the end of the 1970s, roughly 6 million people as a conservative estimate between two waves. By the end of the 1970s, Black populations had become large and sustained communities in many northern western cities. That's showing up, right, excellent. Cities like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Detroit, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Portland, Newark, Seattle, Boston, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Cleveland, Denver, Kansas City, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Buffalo, and Washington, D.C., just to name a few. So large was this migration that by 1940, the percentage of Black persons in the South dropped from over 90% to about 77%. And by 1970, just over 52% of the population remained in the South. Nearly half, over 70 years, left southern states. So why then are we talking about the Great Migration today, and why is it important for us and for this historian to ramble on about it? Because one of the major players in this Great Migration, someone who has impacted not only our community, but northern communities as well, is the incredible Zora Neale Hurston. Woo! There we go. In order to understand her life better and her contributions that we celebrate today, we must understand the context with which surrounding her life in Florida and the South, but also in places that she went, places like Chicago and New York in the North. We will return to Zora later, but for now, her life maps onto what we are speaking about today, from her Eatonville residency, outlined by my great colleague, Professor Bob, to the lives of the millions, and I mean that word literally, millions of people searching for a better life in the Great Migration. So why? In order to understand why people left, something that those in Albany, Georgia, or even Orlando, Florida could not comprehend. We have to understand the economic and political systems that people were leaving, that they were living under. For Black persons after the Civil War, the Southern landscape had changed dramatically. Although the 13th Amendment abolished slavery and slavery was no longer equal or no longer legal, it didn't mean that they were exactly equal. How did the labor and the working arrangements change? Beyond the other issues brought into being by this, and we can speak about the other issues of Reconstruction in the Q&A, in most cases, the plantations and the land of which that and the owners of them did not get abolished as slavery itself was. How then would the owner of the land get formerly enslaved persons to work on their land? A new form of arrangement, what we call sharecropping, is made. The owners provided the workers, and I want to stress that these were both Black and white. They provided them with land, cabins, seeds, animals, tools, everything that you need. And they did this from the beginning of the harvest season, beginning of the growing season to the harvest. And they did so on credit. At the end of the harvest, the landowner was owed a predetermined percentage of the crops. And if that amount was not met, or that amount did not cover the amount owed on the credit, the workers would be further indebted to them with interest. As Henry Ossawa Tanner noted in 1897, quote, and because of the high interest rates, unpredictable harvest seasons, and deceptive agreements by the landowners, many sharecroppers found themselves in a cycle of endless debt that was difficult, if not impossible, to escape. To make matters worse, laws were enacted that prevented people from leaving their contracts as sharecroppers, meaning that they were tied to the land until they paid it off, generation after generation. And spoiler alert, it was never paid off. Worse, laws were also made that they could be evicted, like shown here, at a moment's notice with all of their belongings. Even when Black persons in the South or families owned their own land, they had to contend with the decreasing returns on their crops, unpredictable harvests, blights, diseases, even the dreaded boll weevil. Let's just say it was a poverty cycle that was not easily broken. So one of the things we can say why people left the South was because there was no opportunity in the South. All there was desperation in some cases. So they needed somewhere to go. So what changed? As the 1900s began, word started to spread south that those living in the North, both Black and white, were making more money, experiencing less racism, lived in less fear of violence for their lives. Not completely gone, but less. And that industrial and other jobs were plentiful. We can trace the biggest mover of this information to the social media of its day. We can talk about newspapers. Remember those things? You probably don't. Some of you in this class right now probably have never seen one. But I want to tell you that they were amazing. They were made of ink and paper. They smudged your fingers. There was a certain smell to it. You know, sometimes, you grab a section of it and you take it from there. Newspapers themselves were more impactful than I think we give them totally credit for, and not enough that I can describe today. Because what was written in those newspapers actually changed the course of this history that we were talking about. What was in there pulled people out of the South and enticed them to move to the North. One of the early movers in this great migration was a man named Robert S. Abbott. Abbott was originally from in or around Savannah, Georgia. And despite the many obstacles that Abbott faced, he ended up getting an education, which was rarer in the South. And he was educated at Hampton University and HBCU. And he later received a law degree from Kent College in Chicago. After returning home from Georgia and seeing no opportunities there, he returned to Chicago, and the rest is history. All right, talk over it. He saw that he was amongst a lot of other new people to the city, looking for information, looking for how to survive, looking for opportunity. So he decided to create a newspaper to help spread this information. This newspaper was called the Chicago Defender. The paper, touted as the world's greatest weekly, actually started out with 25-cent investment, 300 copies a week, and made out of his landlady's kitchen. By 1910, business was booming. The Defender began to focus not only on the stories about success and where you can get information about moving to Chicago, but also ads that helped people when they got there. If you're a stranger in the city, if you need help with jobs or housing or advice, one could find it. The newspaper was your source. The Defender also was very, very heavy reporting on racial injustice and violence, not just in the North, but in the South as well. When news traveled of atrocities in the South, he publicized them. He publicized and criticized the lynchings, the violence, the abuses of the society. This paper was widely read. And when I say widely read, it's estimated that 500,000 people a week read this paper across the country. The paper found its way into Black neighborhoods, states across the country, passed from one person to another person, read aloud in homes, barbershops, churches for those who could not read themselves. But how did this paper get then to the South? Surely the Southerners would not want a paper like this criticizing all the violence and everything circulating, and that is absolutely true. But Abbott himself was very smart. Let me tell you a quick history tangent. He worked with people called the Pullman Porters. Anyone heard of the Pullman Porters? All right, the crowd in the back has, everybody else has not. All right, history lesson at the same time. Y'all are lucky. The Pullman Porters smuggled these papers into the South, avoiding the threats of the groups like the KKK or politicians who did not want these papers and had banned them in southern cities. So who were these Pullman Porters? The Pullman Porters worked for the Pullman Coach Company. Pullman coaches were train cars, and boy, oh boy, they were fancy. They were white only, and they were supposed to be all-encompassing. They were supposed to have your sleeping and your eating. You lived in luxury, and I mean, that is some luxury right there. The porter's job was essentially to cater to the whims of the passengers themselves, from shining their shoes, to carrying their luggage, to setting up and cleaning up their rooms and beds in their cars, basically serving all of the needs of the passengers. Who better, thought founder George Pullman, than former slaves to fill this position? He was very open about this. Former slaves make perfect porters because they would know how to best cater to the whims of white passengers' every needs. As you probably suspect, Pullman porters were underpaid, another reason why George Pullman decided to hire them. They were overworked. They were experiencing constant racism. But despite all that, Pullman was the largest employer of Black men in the country, and a job and a career sought out by many Black persons because of the advantages that it gave, not only traveling the country, but a steady and although small wage they received. Many were able to actually get a wage and a job in a world where Black people weren't hired for white businesses. A job at Pullman was an entry into the growing Black middle professional class. And I tell this because the Pullman coaches were the most popular train traveling cars for decades. They went all over the country. And with these trains came Pullman porters. So the Pullman porters themselves, we can thank them for spreading all of this news. They brought the newspapers with them from northern cities, not just the Chicago Defender, but other newspapers. And with that, they brought news of what the opportunities were in the North, but the atrocities around them in the South. Just because you lived in Alabama, you might not have heard what happened in Florida, but the Chicago Defender did. It also brought up information about new art, jazz, blues, singers, all sorts of things were found in the Chicago Defender. Abbott trusted the Pullman porters because the Pullman porters themselves were believed to be not only upstanding citizens, which they were, but that they wouldn't cause trouble in southern cities, which they did when they started smuggling things. But trouble is an interesting word. Thanks to them, news spread further than it possibly would have had otherwise. Did I get everyone? I did. There we go. So as news spread to the northern world that many Black persons were inhabiting, it was a prosperous world. Northern industries were booming. Things like automobiles in Detroit, meatpacking in Chicago, steel and ironworks in Pittsburgh. The demand for workers led to higher paying jobs, sometimes as much as $5 a day in northern factories. And that's a lot of money when you consider that the average person in the South was making less than 75 cents a day. So you can see that the lure of that alone and that opportunity would make people want to leave. How many of you would have left for $5 a day if you were only going to make 75 cents a day? How many of you would leave this college right now for 100 grand somewhere else? 100 grand a week, 100 grand, yeah, you know, exactly, right? So when the money talks, the feet move, right? James Baldwin, amongst the many amazing things that he has said and written, he actually wrote a poem in 1949 called Gone that I think really encapsulates this. I pick up my life and take it away on a one-way ticket, gone up north, gone out west, gone. Between the economic realities of the South, the sharecropping or the poor wages, the racist hiring practices pushed people to migrate. Or they were lured north because of the economic prospects and opportunities that helped pull people to leave. It's easy to see why so many left when they did. But we cannot speak about the Great Migration without speaking about the ever-present political situation, the segregated system of Jim Crow, and the violence of living in the South. Now, when I said at the beginning that people in Georgia and Florida really couldn't understand why people left, this might have been a reason. They didn't have an issue with Jim Crow and segregation. So why should Black people? Why should Black people, for example, have an issue walking up the stairs to a separate part of the theater to watch separated from whites? So what, in fact, was Jim Crow? It was the system of separate but equal, after that famous Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1897, that set into law two separate societies, one Black and one white, separated in all things, including the funding. As long as a separate and equal access or facility was made, it was lawful to separate the races. But separate was obviously never equal, and despite saying otherwise, taxes were never separated equally between communities. As such, Black schools, train cars, communities were not only underfunded, but they also became more rundown and dilapidated, year by year, as they did not have equal access to the necessary resources to make their communities thrive. And if that were not bad enough, Jim Crow also stipulated that Black persons could not intermingle with whites, couldn't sit on the same benches, drink at the same water fountain. They couldn't sit in the same section of the trains or on buses. They couldn't attend the same hospitals, the same waiting rooms, the same theaters. They even had to be buried in different graveyards. It was unlawful to have any sort of relation, wink, wink, if you know what I mean. It was also unlawful to protest any of this. And politically speaking, despite the 14th and the 15th Amendments, which both guaranteed Black citizenship and voting rights were stripped away with poll taxes and literacy tests. If you want to have a good time, look up the Louisiana literacy test, and I challenge you to pass it and see how oppressive it can actually be. Paying the taxes or even passing the literacy test itself was a problem. If you were too smart, there was also being a problem. So just to be clear, Black persons could not inhabit the same spaces, have access to the same facilities and institutions, and most of the time had no access to the voting or the political process itself. When they tried to change these things, violence often followed. So I'm going to give you an example close to home. This is my violence warning. This is a violent story, but one that highlights, I think, everything that I've said so far, bringing it all together. Did I go too far? I didn't go too far. Dilapidated schoolhouses, by the way. On November 2nd of 1920, in the first presidential election after World War I, Moses Norman, and that's not Moses Norman, showed up to vote in Ocoee, Florida. You might have heard of that place. When Norman arrived, he was turned away by white poll workers who informed him that he was not allowed to vote on account for having paid or not paying his $1 poll tax. Norman, on the advice of his friend, a local white judge named John Chaney, was encouraged to try again, showing up a second time to the poll in clear defiance of the white supremacy. This was too much for many to bear. Now, the town of Ocoee at this time was roughly 800 people, and unlike so many places in the South, was actually quite accommodating for its time. In fact, Black and white people had lived interspersed and with relative peace for roughly 30 years or so. So when Norman shows up a second time, he's met with a large amount of resistance and clashes with a group of a growing crowd of angry observers. As the day goes on, brewing resentment and fear of violence grows. Norman visits the house of his partner, this man right here, Julius or July Perry. Perry and Norman, they were business partners. They were labor brokers. They were well known in town. They were prosperous despite the Jim Crow. And up until that point, Black residents in Ocoee not only looked up to them, but had them to thank for not only brokering jobs, but some of their safety. They had good relations with white businesses, and they were respected within both communities. But that day changed things. Norman, fearful for his life, told Perry he was leaving town. The death threats, the angry mob, all of this was too much. And he feared for his safety. He told Perry that he should fear too. Perry did not leave. That night, an angry mob descended on Perry's house, and they were searching for Norman. Perry and his family stood ground. They barricaded the doors. A gunfight ensues. Perry is shot and captured. He is dragged through the city. He is lynched at the home of Judge Cheney, strung up on a power pole. The next night was also filled with violence and destruction. More than 250 mobsters, when they finally dispersed, 22 Black homes had been destroyed, as well as 2 churches and a Black fraternal lodge burned down. The number of Black persons killed is hard to pinpoint, but estimates between 30 and 60 were killed. Moses Norman was not one of them. Moses Norman was never found by the angry mob searching for him. He ended up in the Great Migration. He ended up north in New York City. So while this history, once so very close to us, is so hard to hear, it is necessary to hear. For we cannot understand the Great Migration until we understand the ever-present fear and violence in the South, even a progressive South like Ocoee. By 1930, the Black population of Ocoee had fallen from 255 to 2. So taken together then, the promises of the North, the realities of the South, what would you do? Now, the North was not all sunshine and rainbows. Either we can discuss that a little bit more in the Q&A if you'd like to. But discrimination and racism was also there and present in the North. And things didn't go away as soon as you crossed the Mason-Dixon line. Things remained tough. Poverty was still a major issue. Segregation in places like Detroit. But it was different. It was a different place to live. It was racism, but with a different face. I don't want everyone leaving here thinking that the North was fine, because it wasn't, because the civil rights movement that follows is a national movement. It happens all across the nation, not just in the South, and that is because of the Great Migration itself. But there were many strategies to stop Black people from moving. Southern businesses raised wages, that didn't work. People blocked the trains. They physically harmed or intimidated others to stay in the South. You were beaten if you stayed, you were beaten if you left. But they did leave, and despite this, 2 things were available in the North that made it so much more enticing beyond the money: the right to educate and the right to vote. So I want to change focus here, because a lot of this has been doom and gloom, and I understand that. The Great Migration and many of the histories we tell, including the last 15, 20 minutes that I have been going on, have been focused on what has been done to Black people. And I want to change that. I want to talk about what has been done by these very Black people. The lessons we learn from this and the stories we tell also need to reflect the personal, the triumphs, the impact that travelers had on these United States. The Great Migration was, for every single one of those millions who made the trip and made the decision to leave home and their loved ones, their community, their homeland, their lineage, to search for political prosperity or economic freedom or personal safety, that they had, as Dr. Bassett said, control and agency in their own lives, to create their own destinies, their own identities, and to try to succeed. And many succeeded in more ways that you know. They shaped this country in so many ways, and yet, how many of you have actually thought about the Great Migration in any way and how it's shaped you? So maybe asking another question will showcase sort of what it is I'm talking about here. I'm going to give you 10 seconds without using your phone, cheaters. Can you, in your head, name someone who either participated in or was a descendant of the Great Migration, not named Zora Neale Hurston? I'll give you 10 seconds. 10 seconds. Okay, I'll give you no more seconds. How many of you got one person? All right, a couple got one. How many got two? How many have five? No, definitely not five, just one, okay. And I think therein lies sort of the problem that we have, is that we don't talk about this and we don't highlight enough of the people that impacted our country in the way that they did. So the impact I want to discuss is the various migration impacts, is that we're going to celebrate them today in arts and letters. We are celebrating Zora Day after all, and what better way to start than Harlem and the Harlem Renaissance? After World War I, as soldiers returned home and Black people moved north, a movement was formed out of their experience, what they called, the New Negro movement, which, quote, promoted a renewed sense of racial pride, cultural self-expression, economic independence, and progressive politics, end quote. As the population of New York grew, so did Harlem. Harlem is only 3 square miles, by the way. By 1920, it had a Black population of 175,000 people in 3 square miles. That was the largest concentration of Black persons, not only in the United States, but the world. Harlem was famous, not just for its artistic flourishing. This was also found in Chicago and Cleveland and Los Angeles and other places. But the explosion that happened here in terms of the arts that come from it, it was a celebration of Black life, of Black culture, and it produced works of arts that we still talk about today. And so, of course, one such person who made their way to Harlem was Zora. Growing up in Eatonville, just down the road, her experiences, no doubt, shaped her worldview. She believed that, quote, African-American culture was vibrant and healthy and equal to other cultures. She rejected the dominant white view that African-Americans were somehow inferior and that the African-American experience was tragic. I won't go over her story here. That's for you, and that's your all's homework to complete today. But by 1925, she had burst on the scene with literary expression and giving new identity and new Black heritage a voice, and what it meant to be Black and to celebrate and have pride in being Black. That Black stories, Black folklore, traditions, things like voodoo that Dr. Wells talked about, that these things should not only be recorded, but they should be celebrated. But it was also nothing that we should hide either. The trials, the tribulations, the hardships, the look for the authentic of the Black American experience was the American experience. It was not outside of it, it was American. So Zora, of course, was not the only to affirm the Blackness of their African heritage, but also not to sugarcoat the realities of the Black experience. Writers and poets like Langston Hughes or Claude McKay or Jean Toomer, who wanted to explore Black identities. They wanted to understand this new movement of people, what it meant to be Black, to explore working class life. What did it mean to move? They explored the Black community. Remember these names, go read their poetry. They're actually in this library right here, so use this library, please go find them. But the musical scene was also impacted by the Great Migration, and it is actually just as astounding and amazing. The mother of the blues, Ma Rainey from Georgia, the empress of the blues, Bessie Smith from Tennessee. They sang not only about women and the trials and tribulations, but of also the working class Black struggle, and helped to bring Black music over the color line, and helped to impact music and later generations. And if you haven't heard of their music, please download it now, take out your phones. They're both actually in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, so keep that in mind. Other musician that popularized this in jazz, for that matter, was Duke Ellington, who was not only famous for his big bands, but also for headlining Carnegie Hall. Make sure you download his music as well. What about Louis Armstrong? And I think to myself, what a wonderful world, right? Louis Armstrong. I might be many things, but one of them is not a jazz singer. So Louis Armstrong is another popular musician coming out of this. What about U.B. Blake, who was the first Black American to compose a Broadway musical? The contributions to the music, as we've seen, of all of these artists influenced not only blues and jazz, but also rock, pop, country, hip hop. None of those are the way they are today without those who made the Great Migration and moved to bring their music elsewhere. I mean, how can we talk about the Great Migration if we're not going to talk about Motown, made possible in Detroit? All right, who's your favorite Motown artist and why isn't it Stevie Wonder?
And it's Diana Ross.
No, come on. Motown forever changed music in this country. Motown is possible by the movement of people in the Great Migration. What about others? What about James Cleveland Owens or J.C. Owens, born in Alabama in 1913? At the age of 9, he moves to Cleveland. The teacher mispronounces J.C. and calls him Jesse, and he's known for the rest of his life as Jesse Owens. Yes, that Jesse Owens. The Jesse Owens that defied the Nazis and won gold medals in Berlin, a product of the Great Migration. What about Mally Robinson, a mother of 5 living in Cairo, Georgia, whose husband left her, and she left Georgia in 1920. She gathered up her five children, her youngest, Jackie, in her arms in diapers, and they leave for Pasadena, California. That baby grew up to be none other than Jackie Robinson, another person who changed American history, another product of the Great Migration. Jackie said this of his mother. He said, quote, "My mother never lost her composure. As I grew older, I often thought about the courage it took for my mother to break away from the South." The trains that brought Millie and Jackie also brought so many others. Musicians like Muddy Waters, who fled Mississippi for Chicago, whose impact on just guitar playing alone is staggering. Definitely look up Muddy Waters. James Earl Jones, born in Mississippi in 1931. He leaves the South as well, too. So that's right. Darth Vader was a part of the Great Migration. The last person I will talk about today is Sarah Breedlove, who was born in 1867 to formerly enslaved parents in the Delta in Louisiana. Orphaned and moving to Vicksburg, Mississippi, she flees Vicksburg for St. Louis. She becomes a laundress, struggles with hair issues of her own. She enrolls in a place called Poro College, a Black-owned cosmetic company, as a seller, and then she branches out on her own with her own formula. She changes her name. She moves to Denver, and then she moves to Pittsburgh, another Great Migration story. She also becomes the first female millionaire, black or white, in this country, Madam C.J. Walker. So I can go on and on. But one thing is abundantly clear. The Great Migration is more impactful than I think you realized 30 minutes ago. We cannot understand the United States history without it. We have to look at it, what it was, but we also have to see in it its possibilities, its perils. We have to see the failures, the hopes, the fears, the nightmares, but also those searching for the American dream. So let this talk today not be the end, but be the start on your own historical journey to understand not only the Great Migration, but the decisions that millions made roughly 100 years ago and the impact they had on all of our lives today. Thank you. Time for giveaways.
Thanks for joining us.